Hello friends. Oh my gosh, the crows. Today's video is going to cover some of my general advice for writing strong opening chapters and first pages, and a lot of this applies to entire books as well. So I did a video recently where I critiqued some of my viewers' first pages, and I plan to do another one in August. I've also just done a lot of critiquing throughout my life, hundreds of stories. After a while, you just start to notice certain patterns. Common mistakes that can weaken a story. I mention pretty much all of these in my first page videos, but those are kind of a deep dive. So I thought it might be good to have like one video that kind of gathers together a lot of the common ones in one place. My name is Lydia Foxglove and I'm a fantasy author. I've been making my living as a writer since 2009 and I've been both traditionally and self-published. Now on to the list. Number 1. Explaining too much. It is such a common impulse in first chapters to explain way more than the reader actually needs. You might feel compelled to tell them everything about the main character on the first page, or say you're writing a fantasy and you use an unfamiliar term and you feel the need to explain everything about it, even though it could stand alone in context. You're just not allowing the reader to be patient or curious about anything. And on a more micro note, one of the most common mistakes that I see is actually just explaining every little action and movement that the character is taking. You don't need to say, she stood up, walked over to the door, and swung it open. A lot of these little actions can be filled in. A lot of dialogue tags you might not actually need because the dialogue is conveying the sense of how they would have said it. She hissed. She said angrily. Dialogue can often be heard in the reader's mind without having to tell them how it was said. Perhaps one of the most insidious ones that I see is feeling the need to explain a character's entire thought process, especially about something relatively minimal or something that could just be moved along. Sometimes when you're in the character's head, you start to live in the moment and things just kind of pop up in your head as if you're living an actual life and you're not allowing yourself to simplify things. You're actually treating your character's life as if you were narrating your own day. Let me give you an example. Let's say that you are a woman walking down the street of a town and you see a kind of bedraggled looking guy with a backpack and he looks a little lost or hungry, maybe a little desperate. You're going to go through a lot of calculations in your mind, like you're going to note all of those things. Does this guy need directions? Does he need help? Is he asking passerby for money? Is he harmless? Does he look like he might be on something? That might be your real life as a woman walking down the street, but in the book, you don't actually need to say all that unless this interaction is really important and this is the introduction of a character. But I will see in books people going through this entire description and like this entire thought process of something like that, a fairly trivial little encounter. You might sometimes want a trivial encounter in order to show something about your character or the setting. Like if the story is set in a gritty neighborhood, that might be part of the background. If you want to show that your character is a really kind-hearted person, you might show them handing out money or offering money to a random stranger who looks like they need help. But a lot of times in newbie books, I will see someone just kind of telling the story like in the moment. And I'm guilty of this too because when I'm in a character's head, I see it play out like a movie, or actually not even like a movie because a movie would have better pacing, but like they're living a real life. I'll notice all these little things, random details as they're moving through the world. That will kind of surprise me, like, oh, I didn't know that was going to be there. And then I'll end up describing like the whole thing. Well, when you're going back and looking at what you wrote, that's the time to think, did I actually need that? Like, is that really adding anything to the setting or the character? Or could I trim it back or maybe change it up and not describe the details in that way? When you're doing editing, you want to think about what's like really actually important and not what you just happen to see happening to the character. Disheveled editing, Lydia here. I just wanted to note, I'm not sure I explained this in a succinct way, but when I was a beginner, I tended to write like, well, that's the way it happened. That's what I saw. Like some kind of method acting for writers almost, where I felt like I needed to be true to the story that I was seeing in my head. And eventually I realized that that isn't really the best way to tell a story. There's no harm in cutting some things that just don't really serve your intentions. I hope this makes sense. Number 2, explaining too little. You don't want to explain too much, but you also don't want to explain too little. It can be very hard to know if you've explained too much or too little. This is where, honestly, just having some critique partners or beta readers can often help steer you in the right direction, and there is no shame in them saying, I was confused, or you told me a little more than I needed to know. But some tips are, in the beginning of a story, the very first page, first chapter, you don't want to throw out too many unfamiliar words and terms all at once. You want to kind of drip them out so that the reader has time to orient themselves. So in chapter 1 of a fantasy, maybe you throw out a slightly unfamiliar concept of the world. Then maybe you explain the concept on page 3 in a little more detail. So the first page didn't get bogged down by explanation, but you didn't make the reader wait too long to find out what the explanation is. And then you wait until the second chapter when you start to introduce the name of the kingdom that this kingdom is at war with and a little bit about why they're at war. You know, something like that. You want to dribble out these details, not throw them all in page 1, chapter 1. Number 3, just general sloppy line editing. This is just writing that there's not maybe anything particularly wrong with the story or the characters, but there's just sloppy line editing. There's too many words that don't need to be there. There's little bits of passive voice. There's little grammatical errors. All these little things add up to become distracting and just kind of bog the story down. I always recommend the book Self-Editing for Fiction Writers because there are so many little editing tics that are common, and this book does a pretty good job of covering all the common ones. I'm not going to describe them all in this video because that would be a whole video in and of itself. If you are not regularly in the habit of going through your manuscript when you're done with a story and just really cleaning up all the untidy bits, particularly trimming extra words is probably the biggest one, you should. Most writers, even writers who write fairly short, could easily trim 10% of their word count and not lose a single thing of importance. Many of them could probably trim 20%. But then after you've trimmed, you also might want to go back in and add more vividness, because sometimes I find that I trim out a bunch of nonsense and then I'm left with something that feels a little too spare. But this time I go in very deliberately and add like rich descriptions and maybe some little extra character interactions at times, things that really add to the sense of the world and the characters' lives. Number 4, the lack of a strong point of view. Quite a few of the first pages I got to critique in my first video were written in a distant third or omniscient point of view. And what that means is that either it was set in, the head and point of view of one character, but it was very distant. I'm not privy to any of their thoughts. I'm not really feeling much of what they're feeling. Or the narrative jumps into the heads of multiple characters. This is not a very common way to write anymore, and if you're going to do it, you should have a real reason for why you're writing this way and really understand the craft of writing an omniscient point of view. Chances are, if you're more on the beginner stage, you don't. In certain genres, it's quite fatal to not really feel what the character is feeling, like a young adult novel. Teenagers have very intense feelings, and if we don't get any of those feelings, it doesn't usually feel like a young adult novel at all. Romance, ditto. Romance is all about the feelings, and if I'm not getting the feelings of the character, it's really missing something. Something like an epic fantasy, epic sci-fi, historical, is a little more common to be a little more distant or even omniscient. But again, I would not recommend that for a beginner. You really need to learn the craft of letting us into your character's head and letting us sympathize with them. Of course, you can also do multiple points of view and have chapters switch between different character points of view. That's perfectly fine. Just stick with one per chapter. Number 5, beating the reader over the head with basic details and emotions. This comes in the form of opening your book with a physical description of your main character, or a comprehensive biography of your main character, or a really long description of something in your fantasy world, how it operates. It can also come in the form of very unsubtle emotions like, "Oh my God," she gasped. "This was horrifying." Like, you don't need all 3 of these. She could just say, "Oh my God," or she could just gasp, or she could think, "This was horrifying." All 3 of them is just overkill, and it feels like you're trying too hard to hammer feelings and emotions. The more experienced you get, the more of a lighter touch you'll have with descriptions and emotions that aren't really necessary. You'll start to develop a trust that your writing and the reader reading have somewhat of a collaborative relationship, and the reader's going to be filling in some of the things. That's why you don't need to describe your character standing up, walking to the door, and opening the door, and you don't need to describe all the dialogue tags. The reader can fill in a lot of things. You need to have a certain trust that the reader can figure it out. Learning to trust your reader's brain to be a partner in the story is an important part of developing a more sophisticated writing style. Number 6, telling and not showing, except I don't really love this rule. A lot of my favorite books do a lot of telling, but there is a big but. The telling is always very interesting. I will give you an example. The Haunting of Hill House by Shirley Jackson. The first chapter is pretty much all telling, and the second chapter is also almost all telling. So this is the first sentence of the second chapter. Eleanor Vance was 32 years old when she came to Hill House. Now that sentence on its own could lead into something pretty mediocre. Let's say the second sentence was something like, she had grown up in London but was packed off to boarding school every year where she was generally regarded as an intelligent student. Like, that's not bad writing, but like, fairly generic. You're probably not like, wow, I have to read on. At that point, the third sentence better be delivering something pretty exciting. But the second sentence of this chapter, the only person in the world she genuinely hated now that her mother was dead was her sister. Now that is a good next line because it poses so many interesting questions about this character and a sense of tension. You have to read on after a second sentence like that to find out, well, why does she hate her sister? And why does she hate her mother? And what kind of character is this person where she doesn't hate anyone except her mother and sister? And what is the connection between this house she has just arrived at and this hatred of her mother and sister? You have a lot of things posing interesting questions in your mind, and it's probably not what you expected, unless, of course, you've read this book already. So the first 2 chapters of this book are pretty much all told, but they're told very compellingly, so that then when you get to the part where things are shown, you have a fascinating setup and you want to read on. So that's why I don't really hate telling, and in fact, I employ it fairly often. Other ways that telling can be useful is in a story where a lot of time has to pass. You're going to need some parts where you tell. Otherwise, the book is going to be 2,000 pages long because you've got to keep things moving. Sometimes you're going to have to summarize, summer passed and, they did this and this. And okay, it's fall now. And as I just noted, that second sentence of chapter 2 of The Haunting of Hill House surprises the reader a little bit. Whatever you were expecting, that probably wasn't it. And now you have to keep reading. Which brings me to my 7th and final point. You have to give the reader some hint of something a little bit special. Some reason why they're going to choose your book over all the other books in the world. And I do think the best way to do it is if you can pose an interesting question about your main character, their past, their relationships with other people, their ambitions and goals. Something that really makes you want to move on to chapter 2 to see how they're going to get there. It can be something very small, but it should be something that you have never quite seen in that way before. But there are other ways to get there. You can have some bits of just excellent writing, a vivid sense of wit or excellent dialogue that makes you think, I just want to follow these characters because they seem like a fun time. You could have this wonderful atmosphere and setting that just makes you want to sink into the place that the story is set in. You could have some kind of just really intriguing world building detail, some kind of exciting action or intrigue. It can't just be a typical, we found a dead body or somebody's attacking me. That isn't enough because there's so many books that open like that or have scenes like that. No matter what it is, you need to deliver some little thing. And again, it can be pretty small, but some little thing that is unique to you, to your book and your style as a writer. So when you're looking at your first page, I would really try to ask yourself, does this feel like it could just be another book? Is there another book that could open just like this? Have I ever seen this type of setting and character before? It's pretty common to have a book where the main character is sympathetic in a very basic way, the setting is something that you've seen before, and the setup feels familiar. It's well written, but just everything about it feels kind of like, I've seen that before in another book. So I would always think about what is your special sauce, and don't save the special sauce for chapter 2 or chapter 10 or anything except your first page. And that is my basic overview on strengthening the beginning of your book. If you enjoy this video and you want to go into more depth about what makes a first page great, I recommend my video where I critique my viewers' first pages, as well as the other videos in the series I'll be doing in the future. I announced the open call for submissions to that on my Substack and Patreon, but priority is always given to my paid Patreons and Substackers. I also have 5 monthly slots where for $25 I will give you an individual video critique of your first page, which is quite a bit longer than the ones that I do on the videos. They've generally been between 15 and 30 minutes, along with getting your manuscript back with the critiques. And those are private if you just don't want to be in a public video. I'm also planning to do some videos in the future where I go over the first pages of some successful and popular books and talk about why I think they work so well. So if you're not already subscribed and you enjoyed this, make sure to click that subscribe button and the like button. And links to my Patreon and Substack are in the description. And I'd love to know, what are your favorite first pages and what really hooks you in a first page? What do you really like to see? And what do you really not like to see? Feel free to share in the comments. I always love reading them. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time. Bye!